Okay, here we're going to look at writing a method named addToFront, and we're going to be adding that to the list class. In this example, I'm going to try and have you plan out what that addToFront method looks like, and you're going to use those paper cutouts. And if you haven't seen those, there's a video linked in the comment. Okay, so here's our goal, is that we're going to be able to create a list with 3 list nodes. Like in this code here, my variable name is spam, and I add the C to the front, then the B to the front, then the A to the front. And because I'm always adding it to the front, it's going to end up in the order A, B, C. Okay, so imagine I've got a list that has 2 elements in it. So the my head points to a node that has B in it, and it's my next points to a node that has C in it. And I want to add a new element to this, and this should be 4 steps. So I want you to pause the video, and using these paper models, maybe you made them yourself, maybe you printed them out, I want you to try and figure out what the code would need to look like in a method that adds an element to the front. So in the end, what we want it to look like is that, where my size will now be 3. Okay, so pause the video and try and figure out how to do that. Okay, now I'll talk you through how we can do that. Sorry, I'm going to create a new list node, and in it I'm going to put the data that I want to add. So you can imagine that my addToFront method takes in that whatever data I want to add, and I'm going to create a new list node with that data. I'm going to save the return value of the constructor as the variable named node. Okay, so I've got a new list node and I've saved it as the variable node. Now what I need to do is I need its my next, which is currently null, to point to the list my head. And remember, we're calling a non-static method, so that means a method that we're calling on an object. So inside that method, I'm going to have access to whatever object I called the method on, and that is going to be referenced using a variable named this. So what I need to say is node, its my next, needs to point to whatever this dot my head is. So this dot my head is the list node that contains B, and I need to set node dot my next to point to that. So here I said that node dot my next, that variable got the value of whatever was in this dot my head. So it got a copy of that variable, which is just a reference that references that node that contains B. Now I want to change my head to point to that newly constructed node. To do that, this dot my head, that variable right there, needs a copy of whatever is in that variable named node. So I can say this dot my head, that variable gets the value of node. And a last step is just updating this dot my size to be 1 bigger. And I can do that at the beginning of the method or at the end. Creating a new list node and giving it the variable named node, and then setting its my next to point to whatever this dot my head pointed to, and then setting this dot my head to point to that list node, and finally updating size. Okay, so the code that I have written, it correctly adds a new list node to the front of my list. So if we sort of space this out again, so A is pointing to B, and that list my head is pointing to that list node that has A in it, and we still have the variable node that references that list node that contains A. Okay, so that code worked. We're going to look at what happens if we modify that code. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning and looking at our scenario where my this was a list that contained 2 elements. Now I'm still going to make a new list node, and I'll call that node, but instead of setting node.myNext, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the order, and I'm going to set this .myHead to be a copy of whatever node is. So that's going to take my this.myHead and point it towards that new node. Okay, so now this .myHead references that newly constructed node, so node and this .myHead are the same. Okay, but check it out. Now literally nothing is pointing at these elements that we lost here of B and C. So just by flipping the order of 2 lines of code, I went from completely working code to code that threw away the rest of my list. And this is a really, really important point. I feel like sometimes we think, oh my gosh, it was such a small thing. I just had to flip the order of 2 lines of code. But in this example, I want you to see that actually flipping the order of 2 lines of code can be super, super impactful. It didn't matter at all where the line this.mySize++ went. That could go anywhere in this method. But when we're modifying these variables that reference other objects, the order can really matter, and we have to be super careful to not lose track of the rest of our list.